We're recording.
Hi, Mary. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Alan?
Yeah, very well. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you as well.
Did you manage to get a bit of a break?
I got a short break, not as long as I would have liked, but I got a short break. I'm here in the Boston area, and we got lots of snow over the holidays, so it was a white holiday.
Okay, yeah, I saw that there was a lot of snow over there. We've had a different sort of news over here in the UK. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a major company that provides services to the government, so running prisons, hospitals, that sort of thing, and the construction as well, called Karelian, has gone into administration. Which is some story when you consider that they're more than £1 billion company with thousands of employees. And the reason that I mention it is because one of the stories that's coming out is that the directors are alleged to have taken action some months ago to protect their bonus payments in the case of failure of the company. So there's a lot being written at the moment about governance and directors and, of course, the topic of values. And it made me think about this whole area of values and governance that I thought it might be interesting to talk about for a bit. Because it seems to me that values are kind of intrinsic in terms of motivation, whereas governance tends to be extrinsic. And so I'm interested in your perspective and experience in the balance between the two, because on the one hand, you could make a case that governance is a great thing to have around values because it provides the teeth. But on the other hand, you could say, well, if you're doing it because you're supposed to rather than because you want to, that's not an ideal situation. So what do you think?
Yeah. Well, I actually think you need both. You need the balance. You obviously need some sort of governance, partly because it creates clarity. It creates touch points. It creates frameworks for people to begin to have these conversations. But I don't think it's not enough. And a lot of times when we have these kinds of challenges in organizations, the immediate place that people go is to think, well, we need to create a new code, or we need to create a new value statement, or we need to educate people to be able to recognize when something is violating these kinds of governance frameworks and commitments and policies. And I think that's good. We need that, but I think that's often not the problem. I think that what's often the problem is more the values piece of it, is more the fact that there are individuals who are being driven by their own self-interest, or who are being influenced or feel that they have no choice but to go along with certain kinds of behavior. So when you look at boards, when you look at governance at that kind of senior level within organizations, as within the rest of the organization, but I think there's a particular sort of culture on boards where there's often a desire for consensus. There's often a desire for maintaining a sort of collegiality. There's often a sense that the CEO or the leader of the organization will often be the key figure on the board, although there certainly are discussions about whether the CEO should be a member of the board or not, and that's an ongoing debate and an ongoing subject of research. But the conversations I've had with people who work with corporate boards is that there is a concern around what often gets referred to as capture, where there's a sense that we all want to agree, and we want to be part of this special elite group, right? And these are my colleagues, and not only do I not want to offend them, and do I need to preserve the ability to work with them collaboratively, but I also want to feel like I'm part of the group. I mean, this goes back to grade school, right? We all have that kind of desire. And I think that's a huge part of it. When an individual goes rogue or makes a mistake, it's especially if they are in a very influential role on the board, I think it's very difficult for that kind of voice, that kind of conversation to happen. And I've had that conversation with with lawyers who advise boards, and I've also had that experience myself when I've been part of NGO boards. You know, it's a very intense kind of cultural social experience. So I you know, obviously I think governance in the sense of frameworks is essential, but I think a lot of what we're talking about is you know, individuals being empowered and being skillful at being able to voice their values within that kind of hothouse environment.
Yeah, because I've got experience of this situation with boards as well. I remember working for an organization, and the board had been together for a number of years. They were all advanced, quite senior in age. And, you know, the word on the street in the company amongst the employees was, these guys are just protecting themselves until their retirement. You know, they're not actually acting in the best interest of the organization. And like you say, when you get a bunch of people that are very close together as a team, a leadership team, who choose to act like that collectively, it's pretty tough to do something different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very tough. I had an experience recently. It wasn't with a board, but it was with a senior leadership team in an organization. And it was interesting because what I had been told was that many of the folks in the senior leadership team, and it was a rather large team, you know, 15 to 20 people, many of the people within that group were relatively new to that level of influence within the institution. And it was clear that they weren't necessarily identifying as leaders. You know, they were still identifying as people who would raise an issue or would complain about an issue or would feel victimized by certain institutional or organizational practices or relationships or norms. And it was interesting. I had the privilege to be part of a meeting with this group recently. I was doing a consulting project, and it was interesting because they were beginning to learn to work together in a self-regulating way. So when one of the individuals raised an issue, and it could have been a very real and genuine issue, it certainly was genuine to her, but she was raising it as from the position of the victim of it, you know, from the complainant sort of position. And it was interesting because there were other people in the room who are now her peers, right, in this senior leadership team, who responded in really effective ways. So the first way they responded was without any kind of sense of blaming or shaming or anger, but in a clarifying way, pointing out the places where there were perhaps some where she was inaccurate, you know, where she didn't really know how systems were working. She assumed certain people had influence who didn't necessarily have a vote, as she put it, in a particular situation. And so that was clarified. But it was done in such a skillful way that she didn't end up getting all defensive. And so instead, it ended up becoming this conversation. And as the meeting went on, other people in the group actually began to name what was going on, not directed at this one individual, but in general. They were saying, you know, we're beginning to act as, I think the metaphor they used was parents, but it was really, we're beginning to act as the grown-ups in this organization. We're beginning to act as the owners, as the leaders, rather than as the folks who are, you know, simply the victims of it. And I think that's the kind of dynamic that you really want to foster in a board situation too, right? You know, you don't want to be positioning yourself either as the victim or as the one who takes advantage of. You really want to have that self-regulating kind of conversation. And it's very difficult for groups to have those conversations. I think the way they have them is through rehearsing them, through practicing them, through getting better at it. And it certainly requires a great deal of mutual respect. And if the respect isn't there, I think you kind of have to fake it till you make it. I think you have to act as if it's there to be able to actually have it eventually, to be able to build it. Because if you start from a position of disrespect, you're never going to move to that kind of conversation. Those kinds of those kinds of teams we'll never develop that kind of glue and that clear working relationship. And that's all based on values, right? It's all based on mutual respect and dignity and compassion, generosity of spirit, I think, and the willingness to forgive.
Yeah, and all of those human elements and the way that you've just described the very skilled application in that situation is something that dry governance doesn't actually bring. If you've got a schedule of 1.1 through 1.9 of things that you need to be doing, you can kind of provide the documentation and the story to prove that those things have been done. But what's missing there is the piece that you just talked about, the human dynamic. It's kind of a real challenge to quantify and assess that.
Right. It becomes a kind of check the box exercise. Well, we went through this, and this. Yeah. And in order to have the kinds of conversations that we're talking about, it has to be genuine, it starts with a relationship between the people on the board. Now, if you have some individuals on the board who are, who are less than committed to the good of the organization, I mean, sometimes that does require some stronger action, but you still need other members of the board to be willing to come together to take that action. It's not necessarily an individual who's going to be able to play that role. And presumably people who make it to that level, part of the reason they make it to that level is because they have some leadership experience, and so you would hope it's that that could happen. I know it's not always the case. But yeah. It's sobering when you hear a story like the one you just shared about Karelian.
Yeah, and I'm just in tandem with that. I'm just working on a presentation here, and there's a piece about an organisation called the Financial Reporting Council, and they're an influential source of governance advice around the world, and they created something called the Corporate Code, which has subsequently been copied or used in a very similar form by lots of organisations. And they're rewriting their documentation at the moment. And there's a piece here that I'll just read to you. It says, this is proposed text, by the way, so for consultation. But it says, directors should embody and promote the desired culture of the company. The board should monitor and assess the culture to satisfy itself that behaviour throughout the business is aligned with the company's values. Where it finds misalignment, it should take corrective action. The annual report should explain the board's activities and any action taken. And when I first read that, I thought, wow, that's fantastic, because this really can provide teeth in this area of values, which all too often is regarded as a little bit soft and fluffy, if you like. But then when I was thinking about it a bit more, I was thinking, well, yeah, you could create some sort of schedule to check that people are doing points 1 through 9, but does that really do the job? Because just as in business, people kind of play the game and make the best of a situation, so the same could be done for any document that you'd care to produce here. So it goes back to what you were saying earlier about it needing a balance and a bringing together of some form of governance, but not to rely wholly on that, and at the same time to engender the more intrinsic following of the values of the organization so that everything is done in the right way. So it's going to be fascinating to see how they develop that element.
Yeah, I think having a statement like that is very useful because individuals have something to point to when they want to start a conversation. They have something to, reference and legitimize the conversation that they want to start. But I think for it to really have any sort of impact and not just be a check the box kind of exercise, it really does rely on human relationships, people being able to actually talk about this stuff and listen to each other. And that's the conversation we were having a minute ago. So, I think these things are necessary. I think they set a tone. They're not sufficient. I had a conversation recently with an organization in the U.S. There's it's not just in the U.S., but certainly we're dealing in the U.S. with, heightened attention to harassment, sexual harassment in organizations, and, lots of high visibility individuals who are being ousted from major influential positions in the entertainment industry and politics and business. And this individual who called me represented a professional association for one of the groups that's been affected by these various scandals. Their first thing was they needed to figure out how to discipline people who'd been identified. What should be the punishment? And then their second thing was, we need to create a code, And I said, well, those are both good things, necessary things, but call me back when you're ready to talk about, so we have the code and we have the mechanism for punitive action, but call me back when you want to talk about, so how do we empower people to actually stop this behavior when it's happening? How do we help people figure out what to say in that moment that will be effective? Because that's really where I think the rubber hits the road. Everybody's got codes. I mean, the individual I was talking to, after she heard me talking about this for a few minutes, she said, yeah, I guess we really shouldn't have to tell people that they shouldn't rape, and that's true. It's like some of this, yes, of course you need a code, but that's not the rocket science part, So
maybe in this situation, rather than go down the route of the checklist of things, perhaps there's room for an organization to demonstrate its kind of exploration and development in this space. So, if it was to say the organization needs to give 20 examples of where it's explored and be able to explain what the process was, what the thinking process was, what the decision-making process was, what the outcomes were. So it's not kind of a police state type approach. It's more of a, can you just evidence the journey that you went on?
It's a learning kind of process. I remember working with one of the major consulting firms, and one of the things that we encouraged them to do was to identify senior leaders in the organization. They identified the most senior woman and the most senior man who would have stories that they would share with the organization. And the story would be of a time when they personally encountered a values conflict in the organization, where they really struggled with it, and to help them to develop a clear way of expressing it, so that we called them learning stories. But it was basically by sharing this story with the rest of the organization, they were doing several things. They were, first of all, clarifying that they themselves understood and experienced the same kinds of conflicts. Secondly, they talked about their own pressures, which kind of humanizes that relationship. Thirdly, they shared how they worked through it to come to a values-driven solution. So there's a teaching component to it. And then fourth, it kind of makes it clear that, I can come to you now because I know you understand. I know you've had this kind of experience yourself. And they found that to be really powerful, because usually, leaders are presenting the decision, but to present the process, and to present the process complete with the struggle, was a wonderful way for people to identify, to actually give credibility to the decision, and of course to learn from their values-driven solutions. So, I think it's similar to what you were just saying.
Yeah, and I can relate to that in the context of a project that I did last year. We won an award, and the team were involved in creating the award submission. And it was a fantastic way to internalize all of the good stuff that we had been doing, and to encourage and motivate them to do even more.
Right.
Because, rather than somebody else saying it on their behalf, they were saying it from them.
Right.
And they you could see them grow just going through the process.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of accidental benefit, side benefit of the whole process, actually, but probably more valuable than winning the award.
Yeah, yeah. It builds
Yeah,
a sense of collegiality and shared pride, you know.
yeah, absolutely right, absolutely
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So, what else is in store for you in 2018?
Well, the work that I'm doing with Giving Voice to Values is expanding in some new ways this year. I mean, the seeds were planted previously, but it seems to be coming to fruition. We're starting to work across more professions now. So, although Giving Voice to Values as a methodology, as a pedagogy, as a training approach for empowering values-driven action has been, adapted in many business schools and in many companies. Now we're starting to work with the legal education field. I just heard from someone, actually, several people this past week, who've been presenting Giving Voice to Values as a methodology for legal education and legal ethics, actually around the world. And it's getting some good pickup. We're publishing a book on that very